funny because Leo is really straight.
Hello.
Hey.
Leo is really straight.
Wait. Well, we're not. We're.
Oh, one sec.
Hey.
Hi, I'm here.
Yeah, no worries.
Wait, one sec. Let me let me pause the feedback.
Wait.
Because the live stream
Well,
link
we're not.
is open.
We're.
One sec.
Hey.
Hi, I'm here. Wait, one sec. Let me pause the feedback.
Wait.
Because the Sorry, I'm fixing tech right now. Oh, wait, Kate, were you saying something to me?
Nope. Just saying hi.
Hello.
We're supposed to start in like 3 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yes, I'm gonna make you the host very soon so that at 3 we can get started. I'm gonna send a message to the students that are like, all right, y'all, hop on.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Hi, Zoe.
Hi, Jasmine.
How's it going?
I'm doing well. I just finished a spar with Rita.
How was that?
It was good. I read an Academy K against Rita. That was fun to play with.
Oh, okay. How do we feel about it?
Not terribly. There's definitely things I could have done better, which I will work on. But it's not terrible.
So what I'm hearing is growth.
Yes.
Yes, we love to hear it. We love that. All right, getting things all set up. This is like what, my 20th time doing this? Should be a pro, but I'm not. Close. Why is this giving me so much grief? Why do I have Instagram opened up? That's even more so interesting. There's Rita. Yeah, so this area of my computer, I am unable. Oh, the vibes. Okay, there we go. Hey, we're gonna get started very, very soon, giving folks a few minutes to hop on, and then we will start with the general program. If you are new to Debate Boutique, do not hesitate to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'll be talking a bit more specifically about that and all the great things that are to come. But before I do any of those things, don't forget to subscribe. Hit the post notification bell so that you can be notified every single time that we post. We'd love to have you. I'll deal with that later. And save. Awesome. All right. I'm going to pin myself and we will get started. Rita, you look so alive. Looking real alive, Rita. Yeah.
You know me.
I know you alive and kicking. Awesome. Stop share. Ooh, look like I've been working real hard. Okay. Welcome, welcome, welcome everyone back to another workshop lecture presented by Debate Boutique. Super excited to continue to be doing this. And Kate, I'm making you the host now so you can get set up. Super excited to be able to do this for a lot of reasons. One is that information should be shared. These are resources that are good not only for our students, but for students of the community, those who were able to, attend a summer program and some that were not able to for whatever reasons, be it financial, be it time, et cetera, et cetera. Kate, really cool glasses. That just that directed my attention away from what I'm saying to the people. But yeah, it's really nice glasses. I love those. It reminds me how I need to get some new ones. But back to what I was saying, let's hashtag normalize sharing information to the community, not keeping it to ourselves because it poses very little value outside of just keeping it for one subset of students. Other than that, I've got 3 other things to say before Kate takes the stage and presents this lecture. The first is that if you have not already, I'm putting it at the top because some of y'all won't see this at the bottom, is subscribe to the Debate Boutique YouTube channel. We've got so much great content that's already posted here and so much great content that is here to come. We've got our college program starting in about 2 days. And so we've got lectures that are produced for that. And there's some excellent debates that are about to be had starting the season. So if you're interested in the debate aspect of Debate Boutique, then you most definitely have some content there for you on the high school and college level as well. And also, the third thing is that we are launching new fall coaching and curriculum services August 15th. And so this is for individual students as well as programs doing what we have been doing the past 7 months with developing curriculum strategies for coaching programs, but also for one-on-one individual coaching for students. The benefit is that you get access to 5, 6 coaches to really help identify, coach, and train you in debate in the way that you would like, but also a sense of community. We've got a lot of new updates for that have been keeping me up late at night with this notebook right here. So stay tuned to that. Make sure that you're subscribed to the newsletter. You can do that on the website so that you're able to sign up for it first, because we are limited seating, because we like to maintain our staff to student ratios and make sure that, we're a smart program. We want to make sure that the quality of everything rings through as the first priority. Now, the last thing, and it's probably the most important thing, is introducing Kate Marin, who is a sophomore at Binghamton University, is a very, very great debater, is nationally recognized, and is a published author to different articles talking about the sad, sad state of California and our water and fires. So I don't have the article linked in the bio, but check it out, and maybe I'll go back and redo the bios that you can read some stuff from Kate, but is a super, super smart individual mentor and is a argument and research consultant for Debate Boutique. Has been working with these students for almost now a month. Wow, y'all, 4 weeks. Whoo, wow. And you've seen her in some debates on the channel. And if not, I've got a lot of debates that I'm about to upload for you all to see with her debating the staff, her debating students, and also Kate's going to be in a demonstration debate later on today with Kujwa Osei. So that's going to be real fun to see a lot of what you're seeing today with postmodernism theory, stuff like that versus critical race theories. So that's a demo debate that you want to see. Definitely stay tuned because it happens directly after this lecture at 5 p.m. PST. And I think without further ado, I'll let Kate take the stage, introduce this lecture, and y'all, it's going to be a good one. I'm excited.
Alrighty, 1 second, I have to figure out how to share my screen, and I am also desperately searching to figure out which slide had speaker notes on it and which one did not. So, I think I figured it out. Let's see. Something about technoscientific rationality and not being able to use computers. Okay, cool. Whoa, that's interesting as a Zoom background. All right. So let me just make sure my notes are in some kind of order and then we'll get going. So hello, everybody. I don't think I could give myself a better introduction than Jasmine just did, but I'm Kate Marin, an argument and research specialist at the Debate Critique. And today we are going to be talking about queerness and queer theory, which is a hilariously difficult to title presentation considering that this word has no actual real like definition or like standardized definition, which also made setting it up kind of an adventure. So we're gonna start with our summary and objectives. The kind of format of this lecture ended up being that we're going to go through some of the major interpretations and authors within queer theory, and near the end of the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about the major ways that I've seen these arguments used in debate. But I would like to start just by saying that I did not come close to getting all of the authors, all of the literature bases, or even like a fraction of them. So I did the best I could to get a solid like breadth of potential options. But that is the other piece of this is because there are so many different literature bases that we're going to talk about, there is a huge amount of depth that I just do not have the time to go into, which is why these goals are kind of important for this particular lecture, is that the hope is to kind of get an overview of what queer theory looks like, how different literature bases and disciplines theorize queerness, sexuality, gender, identity more generally, and hopefully if you see something that you find really exciting, that you'll be able to kind of look into that and see more things worth reading. Well, they're all worth reading. So before we start, looks like we've got two people hanging out. I wanted to kind of start with the question that will be the rest of the lecture, which is what is queerness? And as I already said, there isn't one definition of this. There's not really a correct, well, not that there are correct interpretations in the first place, but there isn't a correct interpretation of this word. It is very much indefinite, and that kind of comes down to the quote that I had in the description for this lecture, which had to do with kind of the indefinite, the non-normative, the relational, messy, leaking bodies, that no one can definitively say, you know, that I am queer or that you are queer, but rather that like assemblages and networks of relationality and feeling and affect kind of come together to constitute personal identity and subject formation. So does anybody have any like hot takes that they would like to share? Any thoughts about answering this question kind of before we start listening in on other people's takes?
I mean, I read an app about queer theory last year, and kind of how I took it was with the idea of biopolitics and information gathering, and that queerness is something that like sits outside of what is societally considered the norm, which I mean, currently the norm is kind of considered like a default setting, being like a white male, like a white cishet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good kind of description of one relationship to queerness for sure. And I think that's an interesting way to look at it as well, because I definitely thought a lot differently about like how I relate to queerness after reading an AF using like Deleuzian inhuman animuses to understand like identity. But I think that's a really cool thing about debate, is that like all of this exposure to different literature bases can kind of be a way to explore, like for me at least, like my own internal understanding of how I relate to myself and the world and other people. So queerness. So before, I wanted to talk about history for a little bit, and then I realized that I couldn't figure out how to make a timeline like online, because I wanted to do like these ranges of dates so that you could see like when different people were alive. So don't worry about the bottom text, we'll chat about it. But also I put Laurent Berlant in 1927 instead of 1957. So just gonna point that out there. That date is wrong. But in any case, that is the issue with doing things by hand. I can't change them afterwards. I'd let somebody in from the waiting room. Okay, cool. So as I was making this, I think there were a few things that stuck out to me. The first thing is the overlap of a lot of these authors like caught me by surprise. Like my timeline of queer theorists as opposed to my understanding of like some of the authors that I read more consistently in rounds was a little bit off. But when I started lining those dates up with these like major events, which is the bottom half of the like the timeline, it was kind of ridiculous to like look at in terms of like the years that things happened. So like for instance, 1924 is when the first gay rights organization is like in the United States is established, right? And so in 2021, we finally see that it is illegal to discriminate against employees on the basis of sexuality. Like it took almost 100 years from the establishment of this organization for that to happen. And over the course of the lives of like so many of these theorists that are all, you know, working and protesting and writing and like theorizing. And it was actually one of the harder parts about this was like, I was trying to filter out just like tragedy and like all of like the kind of brutality that has gone along this like not very long amount of time, like this is 100 years, and try to create like a collection of moments of like power and resistance. But even with that, it's like you can see here, so like Harvey Milk was elected in 1976. Right at it gets a little bit difficult to follow these lines, I'm not gonna lie, but kind of just before you get into the 1980s with the AIDS epidemic, and 2 years later is assassinated. And it's like that is the very beginning of this movement. Like this is a very new movement in the United States, but kind of worldwide. Or like to look at like the AIDS epidemic is 10 years, right? And in that time, well over 100,000 people just in the United States like died. And it's, you can, I don't know, I felt like this was kind of a powerful way to kind of see all of the history lined up. So I will send this picture to anybody who wants it and potentially read the text if somebody is curious about something but can't read my handwriting because I can barely read it. But this seems like a kind of a good way to conceptualize the era that we're talking about and the relationships between some of these authors. Also, a note that some of these authors didn't make it into the presentation. So I would refer back to this if you're looking for other places to start your reading. In any case, we're going to start with queer theory and psychoanalysis, and this happens every time. I changed the PowerPoint from a Google Slides presentation to a like a PowerPoint presentation, and we deterritorialized the words a little bit, but you know what, that's okay. That's kind of fitting for psychoanalysis, right? Okay, so this is a long quote. I'm gonna kind of talk about the quote. I'm not gonna read this to you. This is a quote from Lee, I always do this, Edelman, which is, I don't know, a lot of people have heard about like futurity politics, the figure of the unborn child, and the way that those things structure the symbolic order. So this is a piece from Edelman's book where they're talking about kind of just generally like the frustration, almost the anger, but not even in that sense so much as like this is a symbolic network of relations that isn't built for queer people, that is kind of set up to create normative structures and codes that are for, let me try that again. Reading this is kind of a lot for me in terms of like setting up the presentation, looking at these theorists, looking at that timeline, I think it's important to remember like the kind of weight of queer theory as it relates to materiality, but we will get to that later in the presentation. But in any case, the idea like fuck the whole network of symbolic relations in the future that serves as its prop is a solid kind of thesis claim to get into what Edelman is talking about here. So the two major ideas that Edelman pulls from Lacan are the idea of the death drive and the idea of Joystones. And it is important to note that this is one of the only structuralist theorists in the entire presentation, actually. But that's because when we get to Foucault, we kind of see a jump in how theorists are understanding identity, excuse me. But in this drawing on Lacan, the structure of psychoanalysis is maintained to some extent, and the way that drives and desire kind of implicate identity and relationality. So the first piece of this is the death drive, which is at its most basic level, the desire for death and self-destruction. So this is something that is future negating as explained by Lacan and also as explained by Edelman. The second piece of this is kind of where Edelman breaks a little bit from what, well, I guess in both cases, from what Lacan is saying. So jouissance is the pleasure, the feeling of pleasure that one gets when you break a rule. And when written by Lacan, this is kind of a taboo. It's like the pleasure that you get from doing something you're not supposed to, from transgressing a norm, from violating an expectation. And so in both cases, the death drive and jouissance, Edelman is kind of impact turning them, that it is okay to feel pleasure from being outside of the norm, from being queer, that the rejection of futurity is potentially valuable, especially in securing queerness and queer relations. And so the figure of the child is the idea that politics is figured in such a way that it prioritizes the idea, the imagined image of a child, of something that could exist, of a happy future without suffering, and that this illusion is figured as more important than queer folks that exist and are suffering and are dying and are being repressed by particular like policies and relations and status quo. And part of this is also when you consider futurity, that this very much comes back to reproductive futurity, the ability to create biologically future generations. And this is, oh, I thought I had who had the alternative take there. I did not. But it is important to remember that Edelman is talking about biological reproductive futurism. And there are other authors that have written about this, that have talked more about the way that securing a future more generally, as opposed to like securing future generations, might be critiqued. But this ability to create the future generations is kind of how Edelman sees that societies require that we derive value. And so this can be seen in plenty of places. Edelman also talks about this in relation to disability, in relation to kind of traditional gender roles, that, you know, a woman is expected to stay in the home and be a good housewife and bear the children and raise them so they can grow up and be the future generations. And if this is the only way to derive value, then people who cannot or choose not to, or for any other reason do not kind of follow this norm, do not derive value at all and are figured in a incredibly pessimistic way. So if society is set up this way, set up to continue this way, then the future, as is like imagined, is intrinsically anti-queer. There cannot be a future of society that isn't built on the idea of reproductive futurity and of those value systems that are kind of structured by codes and norms that are intentionally made inaccessible. And so, to borrow from Sexton and Wilderson and plenty of other authors, Edelman would characterize this as a kind of social death, that there is not a political future that for queer populations in the same way that there is not a future, that they are figured as already dead and that they are unable to produce what is figured as kind of generative of value. And so in debate, this is often read with an ontology argument as well, that the way we understand the future, the way that we are and exist, is kind of figured in a way that requires this understanding of value. And this is kind of how we get to the very intense kind of pessimism. But there are answers, there are always answers, right? And so one of these things is kind of Joystones as an answer, to take pleasure in the taboo, to take pleasure in kind of breaking that expectation or breaking the norm, and to embrace in the present moment, even when that is not kind of allowable or valuable to society in whatever way society is deemed. So that is Edelman, and we're going to talk about Berlant. So Berlant is not like strictly a psychoanalyst, or not, I'm sorry, that was backwards, not strictly a queer theorist. They were very much a psychoanalyst, but the way that Berlant explains temporality is kind of linked to some of the later explanations that we'll come to about alternative understandings of temporality in relation to queerness. So the first thing is that Berlant has figured affect as structural, that we affectively perceive the present before we can logically process it. And so we cannot imagine an outside to the present moment, that maybe not that we cannot imagine, but that it will always be figured by it, that it is over-deterministic. And this is interesting because it kind of crosses through a lot of literature bases. If anybody's read capitalist realism, the idea that we cannot imagine a world that is not already structured by capitalism. And so in this way, I'm forgetting what the debate phrase is, but it's like you can frame your decision making and your understanding. You are already being pulled towards a vision that prioritizes the future. And this leads to cruel optimism because we subconsciously desire the present. We are biased towards it and we lean into it. And this is, as Berlant eventually explains, a way that neoliberalism is able to co-opt radical movements by kind of figuring the present as an inevitable part of the future. So as we talk about futurity politics, as we talk about movement building, as we talk about temporality, I think it's an important kind of basis to have, that there's this underlying notion that we are attached to our understandings of the future, our understandings of like movements, and our current understandings of things like relations and politics, which tend to overdetermine and implicate the way we're able to view potentialities. And rest in peace to Berlant, that was very recent. So we're going to move along from psychoanalysis and talk a little bit more about post-structural theories. So again, we can see that my title got all over the place. So we're going to start the rest of the sections. That's kind of a weird way to look at it, but in my mind, we've got like psychoanalysis, which is structural, and then the rest of the sections will kind of build and interrelate a lot more. So we will start with Foucault. I need to figure out where my notes on Foucault went. Here we go. Okay, so Foucault, if you, for those of you who saw the timeline or are still thinking about the timeline, was writing kind of first. And this piece, The History of Sexuality, is part of a couple pieces that are critiquing something that, well, I'll explain, basically historical materialism. But I almost said Deleuze. Foucault is kind of a pre-queer theory queer theorist. And this serves as a foundation for a lot of further critiques that will kind of build on the way that Foucault understands progress narratives, futurity, sexuality, and so on and so forth. So the structuralist understanding of queerness kind of had two very related pieces as Foucault was writing. The first was the Marxist narrative of historical progress, the idea that, you know, the dialectic over time will kind of end up in a linear way in a utopian version of communism, and that is inevitable. We will get there. It will get better. We are making progress. And the other piece of this is liberal progressivism, that there will be rights, there will be liberation, there will be acceptance. We'll get there eventually. You just have to wait. And that over time, we make progressive steps towards a better, more open, more free world. And that constant narrative of we will get there eventually, first of all, is kind of used to put off concerns surrounding structural violence more generally, but in particular in this lecture in relation to queerness. And also is not true. And so that is what Foucault is targeting in this critique. So it's part of, they're not really a series. I think that they're very related. So you can look at Discipline and Punish, which takes a similar approach in terms of analyzing disability over time, particularly what Foucault refers to as madness. And the idea is that we are not on kind of a linear progressive trend, that it is not necessarily better to be in his terms of art, mad now or later than it was. And that actually, if you look pre kind of neoliberal capitalism, before the way that productive capacity were used to derive value, particularly in regions that like non-colonized regions before the Enlightenment kind of messed that up for everyone, that madness itself had a kind of value, that the productive potential wasn't termed in relation to capital, but rather in affect, relationality, and storytelling and creativity. And that when that was lost, when it became how much of a worker can you be, how much money can you make your boss, that madness lost that kind of like social value. And you see kind of Discipline and Punish follows institutionalizations and kind of the dehumanization and I'm forgetting what the second word was, but the process of kind of disciplining disability. So History of Sexuality takes a similar approach to understanding queerness and progress over time. The idea is that pre-capitalism, pre-imperialism, that gender identity was part of life. It wasn't even necessarily termed as an identity. It was just kind of a mode of existing. That there were, there are plenty of examples. You can look at indigenous groups that have understandings of like two-spirit folks, or even just societies in which being like non-gender conforming was okay, or not even okay, but just unquestioned. But the idea of the Enlightenment and the kind of instantiation of humanism and the Western gender binary was developed and then exported via imperialism, and that it is not necessarily better, according to Foucault's analysis, to be queer now or to be queer post kind of this Enlightenment imperialist rationality, but that the idea that we are only ever moving towards something, that everything is getting better, can be used to delegitimize the kinds of suffering that people are going through, the kinds of oppression that people face in the status quo, because it allows governance and those in positions of power to claim, well, it's as good as it's ever been and it's only going to get better. You know, you just have to wait. We'll get there eventually. The other important thing is, and especially in relation to kind of these pre-colonial theories of gender and identity, or understandings of them, is that queerness was not really an identity group. It was a collection of actions or activities. It was things that you did, the ways that you related, the kinds of just vibes that you had and that you encouraged in yourself and in other people, right? And that until the kind of introduction of biopolitical processes of management and control and domination and like, not algorithms, that's not what I meant to say, but kind of algorithms like coding, that there wasn't even the need to group these things into a definite identity, but that we end up with this ordering principle that relies on this gender binary, and that is new. And that, I guess, basically, that there can be new forms of oppression that are bad. I know that's a absurd concept, but here we have Foucault explaining it. So the second piece of postmodernism that I'm going to talk about is Deleuze and queer theory. And I lost my sticky note, so we're just going to vibe through it. So the first piece of this is actually mostly by Guattari. So Guattari has a piece, I'm not sure if it was separately published, but in Chaosophy, about becoming woman. And it is the idea of identity and kind of the affective relation to identity as it operates through becoming, that we are not static or fixed, that gender is not one thing, much as like sexuality might be considered as not one thing or something that can be explained in, you know, grammars that we necessarily have access to, but that it is a process of becoming, of relating to the self and to others. And a lot of this had to do with kind of Guattari working through his own relationship to gender and sexuality. So I would definitely recommend, if you're interested in reading kind of a very Deleuzian take on identity, particularly in relation to gender and sexuality, I would check that out. It's a chapter of the book. But in a kind of broader sense, the way that Deleuze and Guattari relate to queerness in terms of like primary source explanations, there are kind of three major points. So the first is the idea that there is not a fixed point, that we're not starting from, like one conception of gender and, moving from that to something else, and like that there are static, delineated, like categories, like Kantian lines that we can interact with in a set way that everybody understands and sees and experiences, but rather that everything, and if you were at my other lecture, kind of all things in the universe, not just these things, are in constant movement and interaction and relation and forces and flows and lines of flight ever further towards the exterior, right? And that those things are relational, particularly to the subject that is kind of feeling them and feeling that affect and experiencing it, and that to define what it means to be a particular thing is not only impossible, but violent and also disingenuous. Not to toss some Baudrillard into my D&G, but representations fail to contain reality. So this is an interesting critique. I don't know if this comes back up somewhere, so I'm going to explain it now. But the reclamation of the word queer and the idea of the difference between like LGBT plus as opposed to like queerness, it is that same understanding that there is no real, genuine, and like non-violent way to isolate, well, this is a particular identity that does these particular things, and this is how it works for everyone that experiences it, and it moves in this linear way that we can understand uniformly in a static conception. And the idea of kind of queerness within this more indefinite and relational view is that that's not possible, that it's so much less kind of violent and kind of imposing to simply be queer than to sit there and try to figure out everything about what you're feeling, everything about what you experience, about the way you relate to other people, the way you relate to yourself, your past and your future, and like there's too much there to simplify to one word or one set of words. And so that kind of gets into the second piece, which is the assemblage as subject, which is the idea that even the subject is not just one thing, that you are kind of a sum of your relations, your experiences, your processes, which leads really well into the body without organs, which is one of those hilariously like hard to define Deleuze and Guattari concepts that people bring up. But the idea is just that the body as machine, the body as the body described as like particular pieces that have to work in specific ways, that have, an exact, definite, delineated relation and understanding and function, that they all work smoothly, that they all work just generally, is adiponizing, is territorializing, is restrictive, that they need to be limited back into those like correct categories. So this is, also part of the critique of psychoanalysis, that the affective experience of the world isn't necessarily something that needs to be packed back into a box to fit into whatever shelf the universe has set up for you, but instead that these organs as machines, the kind of set parts of society and existence that you're expected to occupy, that we should reject them, that we should become assemblages, that we should constantly be in a process of becoming and follow those affective flows and desires without kind of leaning into the coded aspects of sociality. All right, we're jumping around a lot, but these are a lot more related to Deleuze and Guattari than one might think at first. So we're gonna move into queer IR, which is kind of the political theorizations in terms of international relations that surround queerness. And this is also kind of I don't know that an answer to is maybe the right phrase, but kind of a development of, or a far more intersectional version of FemIR with I don't know if that's a fair comparison. We'll loop back if we have time. But I'm gonna instead just switch to talking about Cynthia Weber. So I don't know if I should read this. Basically, the explanation that's being given in this quote is Cynthia Weber's take on how the international system uses components of organization and like the idea of like progress and saviorism to, in the same way that gentrification operates. So kind of this familiar concept, something that everybody's, I assume, has thought about at some point, at least a little bit. But on an international stage, it's really easy to see how these same kind of mechanisms of power and these same structures are working in very similar ways. This is the sticky note I was looking for. Okay, note to self, don't do lecture notes on sticky notes. You'll end up looking for them the whole time. Nope, I went too far. We're gonna stay on this page. So Cynthia Weber has a couple ideas, particularly surrounding queer IR. The first is that queerness is figured by the state to constitute an other to save. And or, well, okay, so that there are different figures of queerness. So within Weber's theory, we're focusing on the idea that there is, you know, some queer person overseas somewhere that needs to be saved by the, you know, the wonderful progressive West that is so great and liberal and definitely doesn't have any problem with queer people. And that figures disciplinary power as protected by the illusion of progressivity. This is often called pinkwashing. We'll talk more about that on the next slide when we get to Poir. But the answer to this, or not the answer to this, oh, it's kind of an answer. I don't know that these are things that can be resolved quite that easily. But an idea that is presented is one that says that we should refuse static explanations of power of traditional international relations. That same kind of, those hard lines of identity, those hard narratives of progress, the idea that there is one explanation for things, that things move linearly in a way that makes sense and is easy to explain, is insufficient to kind of address the true complexity of the international sphere of power, of relations, of globalization and capitalism, and, you know, like all of these systems that work in so many different ways with each other and against each other. And that this idea, this understanding of international relations is very much borrowed from queer theory, which is how you arrive at queer IR. And so that answers my previous statement, which is, I don't know that I would necessarily connect this to fem IR. But in any case, we're going to, so we've got Cynthia Weber's theories, and Poir's explanation of homo nationalism is very much related, but kind of looks at some more of the implications of how homo normativity operates. So homo normativity is the idea that there is a good queer subject that, you know, tightens his tie and pays his taxes and is still white and from the United States and supports the war machine, you know, and goes off to work and votes generally, and that is a good queer that can be contrasted against the figure of the bad queer who does things like any variation that is not one of the things that I just listed. So this is linked very much to Deleuze and Guattari's understanding of faciality, which I talked about in my last lecture, but I'll run through it really quick. It's the idea that difference is constituted in degrees from the face in terms of identity. And the face is this like ideal image. Like if Mitch McConnell could design a person that every citizen was, it would be this person. Like the straight, white, upper middle class to upper class Christian man, I'm missing adjectives, but you get the vibe. And so as we move via degrees of difference, there is kind of a loss of the other things that exist on that side of the binary. Things like life and sociality and humanism and morality. I'm forgetting what the good, that's the word I forgot. That was iconic. Anyway, on the other side of that and across this kind of these degrees of difference are the figures of death, those that are figured as unable to access subject formation, sociality, those figured as evil. And so the idea is that you can separate the category of queerness into that which is close enough to normative to almost reach, you know, citizenship and recognition and respect and livelihood, but not quite, but just close enough. And maybe if you try hard enough, you know, eventually you'll get access into those categories. And so it's kind of held above the queer subject as something to achieve, something to accomplish, a reason to invest in these kinds of systems. And this is mobilized very violently across kind of intersectional lines in terms of like, there are only some people who can have access to like the figure of Homo normativity, and those who do not, particularly people of color, oftentimes like poor people, even outside of like Homo normativity, you end up with trans normativity, which is, I think that will come up later in the slide, but it's kind of this system by which you're able to maintain hierarchy even as you let bits and pieces move around to benefit the state. And so this kind of Homo normativity is related to the concept of Homo nationalism. And there are a few things going on with Homo nationalism, which is kind of a theme in the keywords that I've been defining. So the first is pinkwashing, which we talked about on the last slide. The idea that violent international policies or even domestic policies can kind of be hidden behind a veil of liberal progressivism. So the example that I gave, I was talking about the United States, but the example that Poir gives is actually in Israel, which is, as like a nation, able to hide behind this image of liberal progressivity that they advertise like as a kind of great vacation spot for queer people, and they posture this way so that we hopefully in their eyes don't notice, you know, the genocide that's going on also in Israel. And so, I mean, we see this in a lot of places in terms of like the form of pinkwashing, using some part of an identity to kind of cover up something else, to hide behind it. And you can see this also reflected in things like having cops at Pride, having corporations at Pride. And so maybe we'll ignore, you know, that Nestle is practicing child labor overseas, you know, because they changed their Instagram logo to a rainbow flag. So clearly they can't be, you know, like that violent, right? And so this is used not only to justify to the international community or to kind of posture to the international community, but to generate support internally for the nation, to create an image of, to create a nationalism, basically, and to operate as a mechanism of kind of enforcement for Homo normativity, in that you can figure the state as good. And so it's kind of a cruel optimism that there's something to cling on to, that we are doing good things in various ways. And so that serves to create a very violent power structure that is kind of hidden behind this mask. So Poir's answer to this has to do with terrorist assemblages. The example that's given is usually the figure of the suicide bomber, which has to do with reclaiming mechanisms of violence and terrorism to break down international systems of imperialism and repression and the war machine. So Poir is very much related to Deleuze and Guattari in terms of the kind of theoretical basis. So if you're interested, I would say I would combine them. I think they work well together in debate. That was my AF last year, so I might be a little biased. Okay, so fourth section that we're going to talk about is queer death studies. So we got a pretty kind of pessimistic look, or a look into pessimism when we talked about the figure of the unborn child and kind of futurity politics earlier. So queer death studies has, oh, that didn't work. I guess I have to do it like this. Queer death studies is a newly emerging field that talks about the interactions between these things. So necropolitics, subjecthood and humanism, death and futurity, queerness. And the other thing that is not here is the way that crisis is kind of positioned to constantly manufacture spaces of necessary risk, but also to kind of allow for material death for populations that are already figured as socially dead. And so in this case, queer death studies builds upon reframings, i.e. linking death to necropowers, mechanisms that will kind of structurally and intentionally allow certain bodies that have been like marked for death or by death in some way, allowing those bodies to die. And so in response, that queering as kind of, in this case, a verb and a critical resistance to normativities that structure how we understand death and dying and mourning currently. And so the idea of death securitization is not new. It comes up in, I couldn't even list necessarily the fields, like all of them. But it's the idea that when we talked a minute ago about faciality, and you have the figure of the human and of life, and then across from that, on that other side, you've got the figure of that which is socially dead or somehow marked by death. And so that structure exists in a way that creates fear, because the loss of life in that case, not even necessarily materially, but the loss of social life doesn't just create like death, right? You lose, like, you can see the other side. And that, along with like Enlightenment understandings and following that transhumanist understandings of kind of life as this intrinsic good, of the constant need to secure futurity, to create future generations, to allow the human race to continue, that death becomes structured by fear. And that creates what is underneath subjecthood and humanism, these like liminal death worlds in which the subject is not quite alive and not quite dead. So you can see, this is a long quote on the side. I have no idea if y'all are actually reading it, but it says that the experiences of marginalized communities who are excluded from discourses on death, dying, grief, and mourning, and that these are linked to heteronormative models of family. And so the idea, looking back at Edelman, that there is a proper family structure, that is how you derive value, that if you haven't done so, that somehow, not even that your life has less value, but that somehow you are not living, that you have lost the hold on kind of the human and subject formation. And so another kind of author that queer death studies draws on is Mbembe, who wrote a lot about neocolonialism. And this is kind of where you get necropolitics, the idea that it is not necessarily an optimization of life, but a political strategy of letting certain populations die, and that we need to be analyzing these things not only in terms of material death, but in terms of social death. So how do things like disposability politics operate, and how are those things following heteronormative understandings of futurity? So queer death studies. And this is a longer section. So gender and identification. There are a lot of takes on this, like so many takes. So these are some kind of greatest hits. So I don't know that I could have given a queer theory lecture and not talked about Butler. So Butler theorizes gender as a kind of performativity. We did already talk about affect, and affect is also kind of related to queerness and gender via Butler's theory, that the identity, okay, there are a lot of pieces here. Let me try that again. So the first piece is that Butler agrees with Foucault that identity is a collection of actions and activities that does not necessarily have to operate in a particular way and shouldn't be grouped into an identity. These things are mediated by affect, and that often takes the form of like relationality, particularly like interpersonal relationality. And so this system, this network of relations and interactions and activities allows gender to be understood as a performance. And that performance changes via context, in the presence of different relations. And the importance of this is that identity is constantly in flux, that even in the case of like an individual who is comfortable with themselves and feels like they've figured it out, and we get back into that idea of like labeling and drawing these lines, that the way that we perform as people, particularly in the context of identity, is always structured by the interactions that we have, by the relations that we hold, by the situations that we're in. There are two primary critiques of Butler. The first is that the theory very much relies on kind of a white Western like figure of transness in relation to the colonial gender binary that we just talked about, and that it's not super effective to describe the way, like when you actually sit down and read the primary source, to describe the way that pre-colonial identities existed, like before this like binary that was exported. The second critique is that Butler doesn't really resolve the idea that this performance is not intrinsic, it is enforced. And this kind of comes back to what I just said, that the gender binary is not natural, it's part of this Enlightenment humanist subject kind of theorization of subjecthood, and that not only kind of ignores the entire point that Foucault was trying to make with the idea of pre-colonial figurations of gender and identity, but also creates a kind of transnormativity, that there is a correct way to be like gender nonconforming, and that figure, that normative figure, will always be white, because that figure is rooted in the humanist Enlightenment European gender binary. So those are some critiques, and I want to figure out where my notes on. Okay, so this is kind of in contrast to the critique of a politics of identification. So this critique takes into account the fact that gender and identification are not intrinsic, i.e. that the performance of gender, if you were to consider it that way, is not something that's automatic or natural, but rather that there is no identity, there's only a politics of identification, that these are the ways in which we are coded and required to perform via surveillance and systems of visualization and systems of management. That's the word I was looking for. And so kind of in response to this understanding is disidentification, which is an approach to subject formation that asks who and where and what and when and so on would I be if I were not situated by context, and in particular this context, if I were not a product of relations, if I just was. And to use that kind of thought experiment to envision and activate new social relations. And this is also kind of figured as a survival strategy to negotiate and navigate a public sphere that is already coded and that is phobic and that is normative, and to create opportunities and locations and social, like micro-social or micro cultures that allow for personal kind of experience of identification, as opposed to one that will always kind of fall into the pre-existing binaristic norms. Alrighty. So before I talk about queer liberation, I have gone through quite a bit of information. Does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns about anything that we've talked about? Is everybody feeling good? Are there any theorists that people want to hear like more things about before we move on? Alrighty.
I kind of had a question about like back on queer IR, like what does specifically like IR stand for?
Oh yeah, international relations.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense to the theory.
Yeah, no worries. Oh, my chair is really squeaky. I don't know if y'all can hear it, but anyway, gonna.
On the idea of queerness as more of like just the like of management of systems, like wouldn't like queer theory just like be like containerizing that idea of like queerness as like a, what did I put it? Like as static.
Yeah. Well, and that's why there isn't like a definition that I can put down for queerness, is that like to create one understanding of it, to create one understanding of what it means, to experience identity or identification would be containerizing is a good word. I'm going to start using that. Would be kind of like containerizing. But instead, like authors present different approaches, postmodern authors present different approaches to ways to allow self-identification, self kind of experience and relations that are like mechanisms to kind of break down the structures that are already overcoding. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Because I can totally re-explain if it didn't, because I definitely sometimes say things that
Okay.
kind of don't make sense. Okay, and on that note, I'm gonna go turn on the air conditioning really quickly. So I'll be back in 1 second because it's a million degrees in here. So everybody can look at, well, wait, if the next slide is a quote, I'll put up the quote. Yeah, nice, good timing on my part. So vibe through the quote and I'll be back in 2 seconds. All right, I'm turned. The air conditioning is on, crisis averted. So now that y'all have had all of like 10 or 15 seconds to look at this quote, are there anybody got any hot takes, any particular vibes in relation to anything they read or kind of thought through while they were looking at this? I'm going to use this moment to figure out where I wrote the notes on Vedant. There we go.
The term like queer negativity kind of like reminds me of what we were talking about earlier, like like the opposite of the opposite of homo normativity, like the like pretty much like spectacle of like not being within like the norm or the binary as like considered of like Western values and certain things that formed it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are, and I am blanking on which authors specifically say that, but there are literature bases that theorize queerness as a kind of transgression. And then there are people critiquing those authors that say that that requires a norm to be transgressed. And then there are people critiquing those authors that say that language doesn't exist, and that's critical theory really be like that. But that is absolutely kind of a theme, is that queerness, when coded, is always considered that which is like somehow outside of the norm, somehow insufficient, somehow unproductive, somehow not in relation to a future. Does anybody else have thoughts about this quote from Queer Nihilism? That's the next book on my reading list, theoretically, if I ever actually sit down and read things that aren't just articles for cards. All right, cool. So Vedant is not actually an author. It is a collective that writes journal, or well, there are currently 3 editions, started in 2012. And anybody who would like a link to this website, when I get to the end and I'm like, does anyone want them reading this, just let me know. But they theorize, they're more of a political theorization than like a strictly philosophical one, with the potential exception of Journal 3, which is of queer time travel. And the kind of thesis of a lot of what they say is kind of what approaches should we take to queer liberation movements? How can we formulate successful strategies? And so they theorize 3 particular tenets of successful liberation movements. And excuse me, the first one is queerness, which I think is funny because queer liberation, like, yeah, okay, I got you. But it's actually a little bit more nuanced than that in terms of the implications, which are that queerness in this case is a form of unidentity, that it is a kind of, it's very much an assemblage. It is relations and connections, and that it is not, individuals working towards one individual goal, but as a group, but rather people working together as a process of interactions and affect and forces and flows and lines of light and ever further towards the exterior. But that queerness also means an alternative understanding of temporality, which is, when you look at the Journal of Queer Time Travel, the idea that reading that piece and that is a window into queer temporalities and what it means to experience time in a way that is kind of unrelated to futurity. And there will be even further discussions of queer temporality, don't even worry. So, but also that a lack of identification, and that kind of unrooted from like historical narratives, like linear narratives, progress narratives, that a movement must be queer. The second is that a movement must be insurrectionary in the kind of Deleuzian sense. So Deleuze is answering Marx when Marx talks about a revolution that is, got dictatorship of the proletariat and the vanguard party potentially, and that you organize and you come together and you take power, and then the dictator steps down, and Deleuze and Guattari theorize a much more horizontal, a much less organized orientation towards the overthrow of governance, and that is rhizomatic. That is, Deleuze has been a pretty big theme through this whole thing, but it's very much lines of flight and interactions and relations and kind of unpredictability, and the way in which we could partake in insurrection that is, I think I just said unpredictable. If I just did, I'm sorry, I had another word in mind before I started my sentence. But in any case, ways that are unpredictable to the state so that they will not be co-opted. And so the third and final piece of this is a queer liberation movement must involve active nihilism. I got really excited when I read that part. So active nihilism is in contrast to passive nihilism, and it is the idea that everything is meaningless. There's no grand plan, all of those nihilistic ideas, and that if there are no values, if the world is doomed and consciousness is an existential accident and extinction is inevitable and we don't have a particular purpose, that instead of looking at that with kind of sadness and passivity, that we should look at that with hope, because we get to decide our own values, our own futures. And so this is kind of a radical uncoding of what it means to move forward, what it means to kind of interact with the future at all. So if you remove one of these three tenets, they argue that the revolution the liberation movement would fail. So the first is, if the movement is not queered, then it's not unified. And I mean unified in a kind of paradoxical way, in that it is focused on kind of in points on a line instead of relations. So the idea that a network, a constantly moving network that is defined by its affective connections, as opposed to a group of individuals in which it becomes easy to kind of lose track of, the original goal, to lose track of that kind of shared endeavor and slide kind of into fascism. That's the word I'm looking for. Slide into fascism. So the second piece is, if the movement is not insurrectionary, the argument is that it will be kind of co-opted and will become just liberalism. This is a pretty common answer to K alts, not necessarily from even this literature base, but just in general, that a formulated kind of structural revolt will just recreate the old systems of power and will, switch out the person sitting in the Oval Office and call it a good day. The last is active nihilist. If the movement is not active nihilist, it will, I forget exactly what it is, but I think I mixed two of them up. One of them, you end up with like high theory academia think that actually might have been insurrection. If the movement is an active nihilist, something bad happens and you end up with liberalism instead. If you are curious about Vedant and you would like to learn more about these tenets, I would highly recommend reading all 3 sections of the book. That is what I will be doing.
I have a really quick question. I don't know if we're okay, so is active nihilism also connected to the homo nationalism type thing, that pretty much the idea that pretty much if we just the result in not being active nihilists, if we don't just specifically just understand now that things are bad, then we'll continue to let big corporations and certain things make us think that things are going good just because they're participating in certain advocacies.
Yeah, that's absolutely one way to frame this, is kind of the idea of a linear narrative of progress. If you abandon active nihilism as a framing mechanism, then ironically, it's not even the active part that would be a problem here, it would be the nihilism. If you lose that understanding, it's very easy to get pulled into this idea that there is a linear narrative of progress and we are moving along it, and there is a grand plan and a meaning, and we will continue to move towards those things kind of naturally through history. And that becomes a problem because the movement then will kind of recreate these structures. They will continue to be affectively attached to the present as described by Berlant. And so you need nihilism to recognize kind of the failures of power and the lack of intrinsic meaning, but active nihilism to recognize the possibility in that and to kind of disconnect that from the forms of the future that we're supposed to seek out. Are there any other questions, comments, concerns? Cool. Queer materiality. Okay, so before I switch the slide and start talking, backtrack really quickly. An example of a successful queer liberation movement, according to Vedant, is things like Stonewall. An action that is taken as a moment of Deleuzian violent insurrection, a moment of assemblage and queer kinship, and also an act of just moving forward with an understanding that this is this is what we have to do. We need to stop following the path that has been set out and do what can be done, what needs to be done, and kind of not put our hopes and our those things in terms of expectations, but rather in terms of action and value. Okay, so queer materiality. This is a huge literature base, and I do not have time to go into all the bits and pieces of it. So I'm going to explain the general thesis and talk about some of the major authors. But another one where if you hear this and you're like, wow, that's kind of cool, definitely check some of these people out. So, oh, I lost some of the names when the stuff got moved around. That's okay. Well, in any case, so major influences within queer materialism are, so this is on the left is the Red Nation, and on the right, I wish I could move their face. I just don't want to mispronounce. Assata Shakur. So there's kind of, okay, there's a lot of different stuff going on and different focuses in terms of what parts of queer materialism each of these authors is talking about in the pieces that I've pulled out. But there's one kind of set of unifying themes, and that is to start with the idea that looking back on everything we've talked about, things like identification and disidentification, things like affect and futurity politics, and all of these things, none of that matters. That's not the correct structuring explanation, because under this theory, anti-queer violence and anti-queerness is rooted in settler colonialism, is rooted in neo-colonialism, necropolitics, in the starting point of the gender binary constructed via the Enlightenment and exported via colonialism. And that the attempt to explain kind of anti-queerness in any other way is often representative of the settler move to innocence. That there is a need to look for alternative explanations and other theorizations, but when it comes down to it, and you can look very much back at Foucault's work on the history of sexuality, and I'm blanking on the other theorist I was thinking about that talked about kind of pre-colonial understandings of these things, that the problem is the attempt to crush difference and expressions that were not homogenous with Western expressions, and the need to expand kind of the meaning-making machines of the West. And I'm explaining this in very like postmodern terms, but the theory itself is very much grounded in the material act of things like cultural genocide, the loss of alternative and substantially less violent and oppressive relations to the self, to the other. And so I would absolutely, I have a link to The Weapon of Theory, which is I'm not sure if it was originally published or a speech. And I would definitely recommend checking this stuff out. So we do have a little bit of extra time, which means that I get to talk about Barad. I do not have a slide for Barad, but I think that the theory is really cool. So before I do that, questions, comments, concerns, existential anguish, and anyone who would like a reading list or an author list, feel free to let me know. But before I talk about Barad, kind of cool. Great. Okay. So Barad was initially a subatomic physicist, and they were doing physics research, hanging out, looking at things, and they witnessed something in an experiment that made them basically just like pause, go, oh my God, this has incredible philosophical implications. Why aren't people writing about this? And what they saw was quarks. So a quark is the subatomic building block of the parts of an atom. So a neutron, a proton, and an electron are all each built of quarks. And so when you go down past those pieces, everything in the entire universe is built of quarks. And the only difference in terms of the quarks is not in individual pieces, but in their relations, like in their subatomic geometry, in how many of them there are, in the way that they are ordered in relation to each other, in the way that they interact, in the way that they move, and they are constantly breaking down old relations and making new ones. And what they are, what does this say? I don't know what the end that last word on that sentence is lost to time and my handwriting, but they are the fabric of reality. And this is Deleuze and Guattari's almost like textbook definition of an assemblage. And what this made Barad realize was that our collective understanding, our social understanding of life, of what it means to be living, is wrong, is so incredibly wrong, in that everything is made of the same set of things, and those things are constantly in movement and flux and changing and relating, but that those things are only defined via their relations. And even that is constantly becoming, in that those relations are indefinite. So this is pretty similar to inhumanism. I'm now realizing I'm not sure that I talked about that in my last lecture, and I should have talked about it when I got to Deleuze and Guattari. But it is a very similar idea. Instead of quarks, it starts with Deleuze and Guattari's understanding of affect, that everything is kind of moving along the same affective forces and flows, that everything is constantly in flux, that everything is changing over time, and that the way that we understand life as human, that we understand the individual is removed from nature, doesn't make any sense. The natural unnatural binary doesn't exist, right? And because this entire premise is wrong, like this opens up to like an incredible number of fields in terms of the things that we need to and should be looking at and questioning. So things like the life-death binary, the like natural, unnatural binary are all things that we need to look at substantially more critically, in that the existence of the binary itself is founded on faulty logic. And so we can start, or not even start with, but within queer theory, the focus is on the binary between what is natural and what is unnatural. And so the argument that is made by Barad is that we should not normalize queerness. Like the argument that you see sometimes, like, oh, it's natural. We can see like queer animals in nature, and like that's normal and it happens on its own. And it's like this premise that things can be natural in the first place doesn't make sense. That this just justifies violence against the intersections, those groups that are still seen somehow as unnatural. That if the binary itself continues to exist, that there will always be some group, some individual, some figuration, some identity that is outside of it. And so that we get here with subatomic particle physics, right? But when Deleuze and Guattari got here with affect, which had a lot less like high-tech science involved, the idea is breaking down that conceptualization of separation, of binary, of kind of hierarchy, because when it continues to exist, those violences are inevitable. They will always happen. And the last piece of this is agential realism, which is kind of the alternative, if you want to call it that. And the idea here is that in that everything is made of quarks, and that those quarks are constantly in movement and in flux and relating and interrelating, that our relationship to being in a very philosophical sense, like our existence on this plane and our comprehension of those things, should always be viewed in terms of assemblage, because that is the fabric of the universe. That is what reality is made of. It's just this constant process of assemblage, building and destructing and relating. And that the way that we create nonviolent relations and less violent systems in societies is to understand that that first binary premise is wrong. That is Barad. Okay, I am going to chat about how this looks in debate, but before I do, we just talked about like a dozen different queer theorists and probably close to as many literature bases and perspectives. So does anybody have questions, comments, concerns, anything that they would want to discuss before chat? All right. Okay, so there are kind of only a few things that I have to say about the way that queer theory is read in debate, because in my experience, it often is not. I see quite a bit of combinations of queerness with other things, particularly on the AF. So like you'll also, or at least I also tend to see a separation between affirmative arguments, which tend to involve D&G's understanding of queerness, and I don't see Barad as much, but like the idea of creation of new relations, the idea that we can have, planes of encounter, that we can take some kind of action to generate sociality or value to life, tends to be an affirmative argument, and oftentimes is combined with other arguments about oftentimes like necropolitics, neocolonialism. So when we talked about queer materiality, those things can often show up in like 1ACs as kind of bits and pieces that are connected to each other. Oh, no worries though. There are other versions of this. I've seen potentially things like rage as like queer rage, or sometimes like femme rage or trans rage as like advocacies, but even those things are kind of generative. So when you look at authors that like the pessimistic authors, they tend to be read on the negative as an alternative, which is that's pretty classic debate. But I will say that I have not seen much queer theory read recently. And so what I will leave you with in terms of talking about how to read this in debate is that I see a really big opportunity to use the arguments about inhumanism and kind of Barad's explanation of agential realism in relation to the water topic, which requires kind of a separation between the natural and the unnatural, and like water as a resource, water as inanimate, and the human as like kind of a living, conscious individual, that those things can be separated. I think what is much more common in debate than seeing queer theory read by itself is seeing aspects of some of these authors, like kind of theses on being and relating, read in particular ways. And part of that is also because all of these theorists are reading each other. So, for instance, if you start with Deleuze, you can end up at Poir, you can look towards Moten and Harney, you can look towards Colebrook, who has the first chapter in Deleuze and queer theory. You can end up at Inhuman Animacies. If you start from Lacan, you can end up at Edelman, and I talked about Berlin, but there's plenty of other kind of theorizations. And so I think the last thing I will say about kind of the general top level of reading this in debate is that if there was something in here that stuck out to you, or there's a direction that you think you want to go, either reach out for the reading list or suggestions, or just pick an author off the list, pick the one that you think sounds interesting, and kind of follow their academic path, because there's all kinds of interactions and intersections. That's one of the things I love about queer theory, is that it's not really identitarian in the sense that people think of like identity theory. It is a lot more about like relationality, subject formation, the way that what it means to exist, what it means to have futurity, what it means to plan for those things, what it means to live in like a world that is coded a certain way. But because queerness is indefinite, because there isn't one way to relate to it, it resists kind of the need to be cohered into one identity category, one explanation, or a static relationship, which makes it really good to integrate with other arguments, but also a very flexible and intersectional approach to theorizing. So I think we're going to do the activity now, which I believe means I stop.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you make me the host and I can end the live stream on that?
Yeah, for sure.
Also, thank you to Kate for closing out the workshop lecture high school series. This was the last one.
Oh my goodness. I hope the vibes were good.
They were great vibes.
Yeah, thank you.